It is 5:30 in the morning on December 25, 1944, and in the frozen fields west of Bastogne, a column of German Panzer IV tanks begins to move through the dark. The snow has hardened into a crust that crunches and squeals under 18 sets of steel tracks, a sound one American glider infantryman later compared to a giant grinding its teeth. There is no moon. The temperature sits somewhere around -10 degrees Celsius, cold enough that rifle bolts stick and morphine syrettes freeze solid in medics' pockets. Colonel Wolfgang Maucke sits in the turret of the lead tank, watching the pale smear of Flamierge and Givry recede behind him, his objective the crossroads town glowing faintly with fires on the eastern horizon. Somewhere ahead, in foxholes scraped into frozen earth around the villages of Champs and Hemroulle, exhausted men of the 101st Airborne Division and the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment are trying to stay warm, trying to stay awake, and trying not to think too hard about what Christmas morning might bring. They already know an attack is coming. What they do not yet know is that this will be the single largest concentration of German armor thrown at the Bastogne perimeter during the entire siege, and that within a few short hours it will be reduced to a smoking, twisted graveyard of steel scattered across 2 farm fields. This is the story of that morning, of 18 tanks that very nearly broke through, of a handful of tank destroyers and cooks and artillerymen who stopped them, and of a battle so encircled by myth that separating what actually happened from what has simply been repeated for 80 years requires going right back to the after-action reports. By Christmas Eve, 1944, the siege of Bastogne was 5 days old. On December 20th, the small Ardennes crossroads town had been fully surrounded by German forces driving west as part of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Adolf Hitler's last major gamble in the West. The town itself was of no strategic value in isolation, but the roads were everything. 7 or more hard-surfaced routes converged on Bastogne like spokes on a wheel, and whoever held the hub controlled how quickly armor and supply columns could move through the wooded, hilly Ardennes terrain in winter. For General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, racing for the Meuse River and, beyond it, the port of Antwerp, Bastogne sat squarely in the way. It had to be taken, and Hitler himself had set a deadline of Christmas Day for its capture. The problem, from the German perspective, was that the men holding Bastogne simply would not leave. The 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division and supporting tank destroyer battalions, had dug in around the town's perimeter and rebuffed every attempt to break in, including a blunt surrender demand delivered on December 22nd that had been answered with a single word: nuts. General Heinz Kokot's 26th Volksgrenadier Division had been grinding itself down against the American lines for nearly a week, its infantry exhausted, its artillery ammunition dwindling. Kokot needed reinforcement, and needed it badly, if Christmas Day was to bring the breakthrough Berlin demanded. That reinforcement arrived in the form of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division's 115th Regiment, a fresh unit that had not yet been chewed up in the Ardennes fighting. Kokot and Manteufel built a plan around it, a 2-pronged assault out of the northwest, striking simultaneously at the villages of Champs and Hemroulle, aiming to punch a hole in the thinnest, least tested stretch of the American perimeter and drive straight through to Bastogne itself before American fighter bombers, grounded for days by fog, could return to the skies once the weather cleared. Timing mattered enormously. Kokot wanted his lead elements inside Bastogne by 9 in the morning. Any later, and the same clearing skies that would let the Germans see their objective would also let American P-47 Thunderbolts see them. What made the odds for the Americans daunting was simple. The defenders around Champs and Hemroulle were thin. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held Champs, while the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment's positions near Hemroulle had never been reinforced with heavy armor in any serious numbers. The Germans knew this, or believed they did, and their planning assumed that 18 tanks with infantry support could simply drive through whatever stood in the way. On paper, it should have worked. The attack that struck in the pre-dawn darkness of December 25th was built around a Kampfgruppe commanded by Colonel Maucke, comprising 4 battalions of infantry, 2 battalions of self-propelled artillery, a company of assault guns, and 18 Panzer IV medium tanks. The Panzer IV was, by this stage of the war, a known quantity to Allied intelligence. Roughly 25 tons fully loaded, armed with a long 75mm gun capable of punching through most Allied armor at combat ranges and protected by armor that, while inferior to the newer German Panther or Tiger designs, was still more than a match for the American bazookas that formed the first line of infantry anti-tank defense. To an infantryman crouched in a foxhole with only a rifle, 18 of these machines advancing together in the dark, engines growling, tracks squealing on packed snow, machine guns hosing the tree lines, was as close to an unstoppable force as the war had to offer. At around 2:30 in the morning, German artillery opened up on Champs, and Volz grenadiers from the 77th Regiment began fighting their way into the village house by house, exactly as planned. Colonel Steve Chaput, commanding the 502nd, deliberately held back his reserves, suspecting, correctly, that Champs was only half the attack. 90 minutes into the fighting, the men on the perimeter heard it, the distinctive metallic clank of tank suspension systems, a sound veterans of the campaign compared to a heavy iron chain being dragged slowly across a cobbled street, growing steadily louder out of the darkness to the west. At 5:30 that morning, Maucke's tanks began their advance southeast from positions between Flamierge and Givry, splitting into 2 columns as they closed on the Champs and Hemroulle road. The left-hand column swung north towards Hemroulle. The right-hand column, and the larger of the two, drove straight on towards Bastogne itself, brushing past scattered resistance from bazooka teams and a handful of tank destroyers that simply could not concentrate enough firepower quickly enough to stop them. For a brief, extraordinary window, the German attack appeared to be succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. 11 tanks from the right-hand column pushed clean through the American lines, past the command post of the 327th 3rd Battalion, and kept rolling east through the dark countryside. One tank commander, peering out through fog and falling snow, radioed back that he believed he could see the edge of Bastogne itself. He was wrong, and the mistake would prove fatal to his column. In the confusion of darkness and unfamiliar terrain, the German tanks had actually driven past their intended objective and were approaching the village of Hemroulle rather than Bastogne. Believing they had reached the town, the lead elements halted, apparently to regroup, and sat idling roughly 100 meters from a battery of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion's howitzers, which were all but invisible in the darkness and fresh snowfall. Incredibly, the German column remained stationary in that position for the better part of an hour, giving American gun crews, tank destroyer teams, and glider infantrymen time to work their way into position around them. What followed was less a battle in the conventional sense than an ambush sprung at point-blank range. 4 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, a lightly armored but fast and hard-hitting vehicle mounting a 76mm gun, moved into positions covering the stalled German column. To picture the M18, it weighed around 18 tons, roughly the weight of a loaded articulated lorry, and its armor was thin enough that crews joked it offered protection against weather rather than shell fire. But its gun and its speed made it deadly when used correctly, striking fast and from an angle the enemy didn't expect. Alongside the Hellcats stood American Sherman tanks, bazooka teams from the Glider Infantry, and gun crews of the 463rd who, when the shooting started, fought as improvised infantry as much as artillerymen. In the chaotic, close-range fighting that followed, 10 of Maucke's tanks were destroyed in and around Hemroulle, caught in a crossfire from multiple directions with nowhere to maneuver in the narrow, hedge-lined farmland. An 11th tank, the last of the group, was captured essentially intact after its crew abandoned it. To the north, the 7 tanks of the left-hand column fared no better. Having broken through near Cham, They wheeled towards Rolle Château, headquarters of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, where Colonel Chapuis found himself with almost his entire staff out on the perimeter and only a handful of men to defend his own command post. A company of the 502nd, alerted at the last moment, moved to intercept, and in the fighting that followed the last of these 7 tanks was destroyed, the daring German thrust ending within sight of the very headquarters it had been aiming to seize. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. Records of the fighting at Hemroulle and Champs are, in places, frustratingly incomplete. Individual accounts differ on exact timings, and the fog and confusion of a night battle mean that no 2 survivors' recollections line up perfectly, a common feature of accounts from this stage of the Ardennes campaign. What is well documented, from American after-action reports and the 101st Airborne's own histories, is the scale of the German failure. Of 18 tanks committed to the attack, all 18 were either destroyed or captured by mid-morning on Christmas Day, alongside a significant portion of the supporting infantry. Roughly 90 German soldiers were taken prisoner in the fighting around Hemroulle alone. Cocotte, commanding from his headquarters in Brasse, did not learn the full scale of the disaster until well into the morning, in part because an artillery round struck Maucke's own command post and knocked out his communications entirely. By the time American fighter bombers appeared overhead around 9 o'clock, exactly as Cocotte had feared, the attack was already finished. He formally called it off that afternoon, writing in his own battle report that continuing the assault with his now decimated division would be neither responsible nor feasible. It is worth placing this Christmas Day defeat alongside the wider German armored effort in the Ardennes to understand just how badly Cocotte's gamble had gone wrong. Elsewhere, on the Bulge's northern shoulder, German Panther and King Tiger battalions of the 1st SS Panzer Division under Joachim Peiper achieved genuine, if temporary, breakthroughs against thinner American lines, advancing dozens of kilometers before running out of fuel. The failure at Bastogne was not, therefore, a simple case of German armor being generally unable to break the American line. It was a case of this particular attack, launched by tanks that lost their bearings in the dark, walking directly into a defensive position it never should have approached. By comparison, American tank destroyer doctrine, built around exactly this kind of fast, opportunistic ambush by lightly armored, hard-hitting vehicles like the M18 Hellcat, worked precisely as its designers at the Tank Destroyer Center had intended, even though the M18 was frequently criticized by its own crews for being under-armored against the German guns it was meant to counter. On Christmas morning at Hemroulle, speed and positioning mattered more than armor thickness, and the Americans had both. The material impact of the Christmas Day tank battle was significant but should not be overstated in isolation. 18 tanks represented a real but not decisive fraction of the German armor committed to the wider Ardennes offensive. Its psychological and operational impact, however, was considerable. It was the last major concentrated armored thrust the Germans mounted against the Bastogne perimeter before the siege was lifted the following day, on December 26th, when a spearhead of the 4th Armored Division from General Patton's 3rd Army broke through from the south and opened a corridor into the town. Cocotte's own assessment, that his division was too decimated to continue, effectively closed the door on any further attempt to take Bastogne by direct assault from the west. Surviving wrecks of German armor from the Ardennes campaign, including examples of the Panzer IV, can still be seen today at the Bastogne War Museum and at various memorial sites scattered around the villages of Champs and Hemroulle, where small plaques mark the positions where the fighting reached its climax. Return for a moment to that column of tanks halted in the dark outside Hemroulle, engines idling, crews believing wrongly that they had reached their objective. It is a small, almost absurd image against the scale of the wider war. An entire armored thrust brought to nothing not by a superior force, but by a wrong turn in the snow and an hour's fatal hesitation. 18 tanks went out that morning. None came back. 90-odd infantrymen went into the cages as prisoners before the sun was fully up. A division commander wrote in the flat, exhausted language of a man who already knows the answer that further attacks would be irresponsible, and a town that Hitler had demanded be taken by Christmas Day remained, resolutely in American hands. What happened at Champs and Hemroulle on December 25, 1944, did not win the Battle of the Bulge on its own, and it would be a mistake to claim that it did. But it closed off the last realistic German hope of taking Bastogne from the west. It cost Kokot's division men and machines it could not replace, and it happened of all mornings on Christmas Day, while American gun crews fired their howitzers at point-blank range into stalled German armor less than 100 meters away. 18 tanks set out under cover of darkness to deliver Hitler his Christmas present. Not one of them made it home.